Before his grand wedding to a woman from a wealthy family, the most powerful mafia boss in New York decided to put his fiancée to a secret test. He pretended to leave for a business trip to Italy, but he never actually left. Instead, he hid inside a high-tech secret room in his own mansion to watch his fiancée on security cameras. He wanted to see how she really treated his sick mother when she thought she was alone. What he saw on those screens made his blood run cold. His perfect fiancée was a monster. But it was the quiet maid's bravery that changed everything for the cold-hearted boss. You won't believe the shocking truth he uncovered. If this story touches your heart, smash that like button and share it. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss another speechless story. The secret room was hidden behind a heavy wall in the mansion's library. Inside, the only light came from 6 large security monitors. The pale blue glow washed over the face of Kastor Moretti, the most dangerous man in the city. The light caught the sharp lines of his jaw and the dark ink of the tattoos on his neck. Usually, Kastor used this room to hunt his enemies, but today he was hunting for the truth about the woman he was supposed to marry. He remembered the warning his mother, Honora, gave him while clutching her floral cardigan. "Watch how she treats me when she thinks no one is looking, Kastor." That is her real face. On the center screen, he watched Sterling Reed standing at the front door. She looked beautiful in her striking magenta silk dress, waving goodbye with a sweet, angelic smile. She blew a kiss and whispered, "I love you, darling," as his car drove away. But the moment the door clicked shut, the act was over. The sweet girl vanished. Sterling's face twisted into a mean, cold expression that Kastor had never seen before. She pulled out her phone and barked into it. "He's gone. Finally. Get over here now." She didn't call him her fiancé. She called him an obstacle. A few minutes later, a secret car pulled up. Out stepped a man Kastor recognized immediately, his own finance manager. Vincent watched through the screen as Sterling ran to the man and kissed him right in the middle of his home. Every smile she had ever given Kastor was a lie. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles turning white, but he didn't move. He needed to see every move they made. He leaned toward the monitor and whispered, "Show me everything, Sterling. Show me who you really are." Kastor sat in the secret room, his eyes glued to the center monitor. The blue light carved deep shadows into his face, making him look as dangerous as the enemies he usually hunted. He watched as Sterling Reed turned away from the front door. The bright magenta silk of her dress swished against the marble floor, a color that used to remind him of passion, but now felt like a warning. The moment she thought the house was empty of everyone but the help, her shoulders stiffened. The sweet, gentle girl he thought he loved was gone. Sterling didn't go to the kitchen or the garden. Instead, she marched straight toward the hallway that led to Honora's room. Her high heels clicked against the floor like the ticking of a bomb. Kastor's heart hammered against his ribs. He adjusted the audio, his hand trembling slightly. He had spent his whole life protecting his mother, and now he was watching a wolf enter her den. Inside the bedroom, Honora Moretti sat in her favorite chair near the window. She was wearing her soft floral cardigan, looking smaller and more fragile than Kastor remembered. She was trying to reach for a glass of water on the side table, her hands shaking from the Parkinson's that stole her strength every day. The door flew open without a knock. Sterling stepped in, and the air in the room seemed to turn to ice. Honora looked up, her eyes wide with a fear that broke Kastor's heart. He realized then that this hadn't been the first time his mother had faced this monster alone. Still struggling with a simple glass of water, "You old ghost?" Sterling's voice hissed through the speakers. It wasn't the soft, musical tone she used with Kastor. It was sharp, ugly, and full of hate. Honora tried to speak, her voice a tiny whisper. "Kastor, is he gone?" Sterling let out a cruel, loud laugh that echoed in the quiet room. "He's gone to Italy, you useless old woman. He's gone, and he isn't here to protect you now." She walked over to the table and, with a slow, mean movement, pushed the glass of water just out of Honora's reach. Kastor surged forward in his chair, his teeth bared in a silent snarl. He wanted to scream, to run through the walls and wrap his hands around Sterling's throat. But he forced himself to stay. He needed to hear it all. He needed to see the full depth of her evil. "Do you have any idea how much I hate coming in here?" Sterling screamed, her face contorting into something hideous. "The smell of medicine, the sight of your shaking hands, it makes me sick. I've spent a whole year playing the perfect daughter-in-law, smiling at your boring stories and pretending to care if you took your pills." She stepped closer, leaning down until she was inches from Honora's terrified face. "The second I have that ring on my finger, things are going to change. I'm going to pack you off to the cheapest, darkest nursing home I can find. You won't have your fancy silk sheets or your favorite tea. You'll be alone, just like you deserve." Honora began to cry, the tears rolling down her wrinkled cheeks. She looked so small against the bright, aggressive pink of Sterling's dress. "My son, he loves me. He would never let you." Sterling straightened up, a wicked look in her eyes. "Your son is a fool. He sees what I want him to see. He thinks I'm an angel. By the time he realizes the truth, I'll own half of his empire, and you'll be long forgotten." Kastor watched the screen, his breathing heavy and ragged. The pink mask had fallen completely, revealing a person he didn't recognize. He realized his mother was right. This was her real face, and he knew that the nightmare was only just beginning. Kastor adjusted the dials on the control panel, his eyes glued to the screen as the scene shifted to his mother's bedroom. He watched Sterling stomp down the hallway, her bright magenta silk dress swishing aggressively against the marble floor. She didn't look like the elegant lady he had fallen for anymore. She looked like a predator closing in on its prey. Inside the room, Honora sat in her wheelchair near the window. She was wearing her favorite floral cardigan, her thin hands trembling as she tried to hold a glass of water. She looked so small and fragile, a sharp contrast to the cold woman who burst through the door without knocking. Sterling didn't say a word of greeting. Instead, she let out a loud, annoyed sigh that echoed through the monitors in Kastor's secret room. "Are you still sitting here, you old bird?" Sterling snapped, her voice sharp and mean. "The whole house smells like a hospital because of you. Do you have any idea how much I'm going to change this place once I'm officially the boss? This room will be the first thing to go." Honora looked up, her eyes wide with shock and sadness. She tried to speak, her voice a weak whisper, but Sterling cut her off by waving a hand in her face. Sterling reached out and snatched the glass of water from Honora's hand, splashing some of it onto the old woman's lap. Honora flinched, looking terrified, but Sterling just laughed. It was a cruel, heartless sound that made Kastor's jaw lock in fury. Just as Sterling raised her hand to point a threatening finger, the door opened quietly. Vespera stepped into the room. She was wearing her simple gray maid's uniform with a white apron, her brown hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She carried a tray with fresh tea and a clean napkin. Kastor realized with a sting of guilt that he had lived in this house for years and had barely ever looked Vespera in the eye. To him, she had always just been a shadow in the background, the girl who cleaned the floors and faded into the walls. But on the screen, that shadow was the only person with a spine. Vespera didn't flinch when she saw Sterling's angry face. She walked right over to Honora and immediately began dabbing the spilled water off her cardigan with a gentle hand. "Get out of here, girl," Sterling hissed, her eyes darting to Vespera with total contempt. "I'm busy talking to my future mother-in-law." Vespera didn't leave. She didn't even look at Sterling. Instead, she leaned down and whispered something to Honora that made the old woman's face soften. "It's okay, Mrs. Moretti," Vespera said, her voice warm and steady through the audio speakers. "I've got you. Let's get you some warm tea." Sterling's face turned a deep shade of red, matching her dress. She couldn't stand being ignored, especially by someone she thought was beneath her. She reached out and shoved Vespera's shoulder, trying to push her away from the wheelchair. Vespera stumbled back a step, but she didn't run. She stood her ground, placing herself directly between the mean fiancé and the frightened mother. In the secret room, Kastor leaned closer to the monitors. He was mesmerized by the scene. He had spent his whole life thinking that power came from money, weapons, and a scary reputation. But as he watched Vespera hold his mother's shaking hand, he realized he was looking at a different kind of power. While Sterling used her status to humiliate a sick woman, Vespera was using her heart to protect her. Kastor's heart hammered against his ribs. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had been planning to marry a monster, while a literal angel was working in his kitchen every day. He watched as Vespera gently helped Honora take a sip of tea, ignoring Sterling's hateful glares. For the first time, Kastor truly saw the maid. She wasn't just the help. She was the only person in that house who was actually real. He whispered into the darkness of the room, his voice thick with a new kind of respect. "Who are you, Vespera Miller?" Kastor sat as still as a stone statue in the secret room. The pale blue light from the monitors made the tattoos on his neck look like dark shadows. His heart was pounding against his ribs, but he didn't move a muscle. He had just watched his fiancée, Sterling, kiss another man in the very center of his home. It felt like a sharp knife had been driven into his chest, but Kastor was a mafia boss. He knew that if you react too fast, you lose. He needed to hear every word they said. The man on the screen was Thomas, Kastor's own finance manager. Last year, Kastor had given Thomas a luxury car as a thank you gift for his hard work. Now, that same man was standing in the grand hall, holding Sterling's hand. Sterling looked up at Thomas, her long blonde hair falling over her bright magenta dress. She wasn't the sweet, loving woman Kastor thought he knew. She looked hungry for power. "He's finally out of the way," Sterling whispered, her voice coming through the speakers in the secret room. "Do you have the papers?" Thomas pulled a thick stack of documents from his leather bag. He had a greedy smile on his face. "I've been moving the money for months, Sterling. $10 million is already sitting in a secret account in Switzerland. Kastor has no idea. He thinks I'm just his loyal manager." Sterling laughed, and the sound made Kastor's skin crawl. It was a cold, mean laugh. "He's so blind," she said. "He thinks I love him. He thinks I want to be a Moretti. All I want is his empire and every cent in his vault." Thomas leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss. "The wedding is in 3 weeks. Once the papers are signed, we can start the next part of the plan. But what about the old woman? Honora is always in the way." Sterling's face twisted into an expression of pure hatred. She stepped toward the living room, her high heels clicking loudly on the marble floor. "Don't worry about Honora. She's sick and weak. Once I'm officially the mistress of this house, I'll have her sent to the cheapest, darkest nursing home I can find. She won't last a month there." Thomas nodded, looking worried. "We have to be careful, Sterling. Kastor is a dangerous man. If he finds out we're stealing his legacy, he won't just fire us. He'll destroy us." Sterling grabbed Thomas by the collar of his suit and pulled him toward her. "He won't find out. He's too busy playing family with his sick mother and that pathetic maid, Vespera. After the wedding, we'll wait for the right moment. Accidents happen all the time, Thomas. A car crash, a fall, and then everything Kastor Moretti built will belong to us." In the secret room, Kastor's hand gripped the arm of his chair so hard the leather began to rip. His knuckles were white, and his jaw was locked tight. He wasn't just sad anymore. He was filled with a quiet, deadly rage. He had spent 17 years building his empire from nothing. He had protected Sterling and treated her like a queen. And in return, she was planning to rob him, hurt his mother, and take his life. Kastor leaned forward, his eyes burning as he watched them laugh on the screen. They thought they were so smart. They thought the powerful mafia boss was a fool who couldn't see what was right in front of him. But they were wrong. Kastor had seen everything. He had heard every lie and every plan. "You want my money, Sterling?" Kastor whispered to the empty room, his voice as cold as ice. "You want my empire? I'm going to let you think you've won. I'm going to watch you play your little game until the very last second. And then I'm going to show you what happens to people who try to destroy a Moretti." He picked up his phone and sent a one-word message to his most trusted guard, Deeper. He wanted to know every secret Sterling was hiding. The game had just started, and Kastor was the only one who knew the score. The blue light from the security screens carved Kastor's sharp features into stone. In the secret room, the only sound was the low hum of the monitors and the heavy beat of his own heart. He watched as the camera switched to his mother's bedroom. Inside, the room was quiet and smelled of lavender. Honora sat in her chair, her silver hair catching the light as she clutched her floral cardigan. Vespera was there, too, moving softly as she prepared a silver tray with a glass of water and the morning pills that kept Honora's shaking hand steady. Then the door flew open. Sterling marched into the room, her bright magenta dress looking like a splash of blood against the calm walls. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. The perfect fiancée Kastor thought he knew was gone. In her place was a woman with eyes as cold as ice. "Why is it so hot in here?" Sterling snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut. "It smells like an old lady's closet. Open a window." Vespera stood tall, her gray uniform neat and her brown hair tied back. "Miss Reed, the doctor said the room must stay warm for Mrs. Moretti. She is very fragile today." Sterling let out a cruel, high-pitched laugh. She stepped closer to Honora, who looked up with wide, terrified eyes. Sterling didn't see a mother. She saw a burden. "Fragile? She's a ghost. She's taking up space that belongs to me now. Soon, this whole house will be mine, and ghosts don't get to stay in mansions." Kastor's jaw locked so tight it hurt. He watched Sterling's hand reach out. With one quick, mean motion, she swiped her arm across the bedside table. The silver tray flew into the air. The glass shattered against the floor, and the tiny white pills, Honora's lifeline, scattered everywhere. They rolled under the bed, into the corners, and across the cold stone floor. "Oops," Sterling whispered, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "I guess you don't need these today. Maybe the floor will help you get better." Honora made a small, choked sound of pain, her hands trembling violently without her medicine. But before Sterling could say another word, Vespera was on the move. She didn't scream. She didn't hit back. She simply knelt on the hard floor, ignoring the broken glass that pricked at her skin. Kastor watched the screen, his breath hitching. He saw Vespera gathering the pills one by one. She wiped each one clean with the hem of her apron, treating the medicine like it was made of gold. She was kneeling at his mother's feet, whispering words of comfort that the microphones could barely catch. "It's okay, Honora," Vespera murmured. "I've got them. I won't let you miss a single dose. I'm right here." On the screen, Sterling looked down at the girl on the floor with total disgust. She raised her high-heeled shoe, almost as if she were tempted to kick the girl who was being so kind. Sterling saw a servant, an invisible shadow. But for the first time in his life, Kastor didn't see a maid. He saw a heart of pure gold shining in the middle of a dark, hateful room. Sterling turned on her heel and marched out, her magenta dress swishing loudly, leaving the mess behind. But Vespera stayed. She finished gathering every pill, and then took Honora's shaking hand in hers. She squeezed it tight, giving the old woman the strength she needed to breathe again. In the secret room, Kastor leaned back, his eyes wet with a feeling he hadn't felt in 17 years. He had spent his life looking for power and status, thinking that was what mattered. He had looked at Sterling's beauty and her family name and thought he was lucky. But as he watched the girl in the gray uniform help his mother take her medicine, he realized he had been blind. The real light in the house wasn't coming from the diamonds on Sterling's finger. It was coming from the girl on the floor. He stared at Vespera's calm, brave face and whispered to the empty room, "I see you now, Vespera, and I won't let her hurt you again." The silence in the secret room was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the cooling fans and the steady throb of the blood in Kastor's ears. He sat motionless, his sharp jaw tight, as he leaned closer to the largest monitor. The pale blue light played over the tribal tattoos on his neck, making him look like a ghost haunting his own home. On the screen, the door to his mother's bedroom was slightly ajar. He watched as Sterling, dressed in that loud magenta gown, finally stomped out of the room, her high heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. Once the hallway was empty, Kastor saw a small, quiet figure move into the frame. It was Vespera. Her brown hair was pulled back in its usual neat ponytail, and her gray maid's uniform looked crisp, but her shoulders were hunched as if she were trying to hide from the world. She stepped into Honora's room and shut the door softly, leaning her forehead against the wood for a long moment. Kastor watched her chest heave with a deep, shaky breath. Vespera walked over to the bed, where Honora lay trembling in her floral cardigan. The older woman looked terrified, her eyes wet with tears. Without a word, Vespera knelt by the bedside. She reached out and took Honora's thin, shaking hands in hers. Kastor noticed how gently she held them, as if his mother were made of the finest glass that might shatter at any second. To get a better look, Kastor reached for the control dial and zoomed the camera in. The image sharpened, filling the screen with Vespera's tired but kind face. She began to roll up the sleeves of her gray uniform to help wash his mother's face with a cool cloth. As the fabric slid up her forearms, Kastor's heart skipped a beat. There, against her pale skin, were dark, ugly bruises. Some were a deep, angry purple, while others were a sickly yellow, showing they had been there for days. There were finger-shaped marks on her wrists and a long, red scrape near her elbow. Kastor's breath hitched. He knew exactly where those marks came from. He had watched Sterling grab her, shove her, and strike her when she thought no one was looking. For the first time in 17 years, the ice around Kastor's heart began to crack. He had lived in a world of violence and power, where he thought he knew everything about pain. He had always looked at the people who worked for him as the help, nameless shadows who kept the mansion running. He had seen Vespera hundreds of times in the hallways, but he realized now that he had never truly seen her. He felt a sharp pang of guilt that burned worse than any wound he had ever received in the streets. While he was busy acting cold and powerful, this girl was standing in the line of fire to protect the only person he loved. She was taking the blows meant for his mother. She was bleeding in silence, so Honora wouldn't have to. On the screen, Vespera winced as she moved her arm, the pain clearly shooting through her. But when she looked at Honora, she didn't complain. She didn't cry. Instead, she forced a small, beautiful smile and whispered something that made his mother stop trembling. She wiped a tear from Honora's cheek with a hand that was bruised but steady. Kastor stared at the ink on his own knuckles, then back at the scars on Vespera's arms. He saw the battle scars of a girl who had nothing, yet was willing to give everything. Sterling had money, beauty, and a fancy name, but she was empty and cruel. Vespera was just a maid in a simple uniform, but she had a heart of pure gold that shone through the dark. Kastor leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the monitor. The fury was still there, simmering under his skin, but it was joined by a new, strange feeling. He wanted to walk out of that room, take Vespera by the hand, and tell her that she was safe. He wanted to show her that her pain hadn't gone unnoticed. He whispered into the quiet of the room, his voice raspy and low. "I see you now, Vespera, and I promise she will never lay a hand on you again." In the dark silence of the secret room, Kastor Moretti sat as still as a stone statue. His eyes were glued to the middle screen, which showed his mother's bedroom. The room usually felt warm and peaceful, but ever since he left for Italy, the air in the house felt heavy and cold. Kastor's jaw was tight, and the tribal tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse with every beat of his heart. He was watching a scene that made his blood boil. Honora sat in her bed, her hands shaking as she tried to hold a small cup of water. Beside her, Vespera was gently adjusting the pillows. The maid's movements were soft and kind. She didn't look at the clock or act like she was in a hurry. To Vespera, Honora wasn't just a job. She was a person who needed love. Suddenly, the bedroom door swung open with a loud bang. Sterling stepped inside, her bright magenta dress looking like a splash of poison against the quiet colors of the room. She didn't ask how Honora was feeling. She didn't even look at the elderly woman's face. Instead, she tapped her high-heeled shoe against the floor, the sound sharp like a ticking bomb. "Why is she still awake?" Sterling snapped, her voice high and mean. "I have guests coming over later, and I don't want to hear her coughing or moving around. Get her settled and get out." Vespera didn't look up, but her shoulders went stiff. She's having a hard time breathing today, Miss Reed. I am just trying to make her comfortable. Sterling walked closer, her face twisting into a mask of pure hate. She looked down at Honora with disgust. Comfortable? She's an old lady who doesn't even know what day it is. You are wasting time on a lost cause. Now move. I need you to go downstairs and polish the silver for the party. You're being way too slow, and I'm losing my patience. In the secret room, Kastor's hand gripped the arm of his leather chair so hard the stitching began to pop. He watched as Vespera stood up, her gray uniform wrinkled from a long day of work. She looked Sterling right in the eye, her voice quiet but steady. I will polish the silver as soon as she falls asleep. Her health comes first. The silence that followed was terrifying. Sterling's face went red, matching the loud color of her dress. Did you just talk back to me? She hissed. You are nothing. A servant. A shadow. How dare you tell me what comes first in this house? Honora let out a small, frightened whimper and reached for Vespera's hand. This seemed to snap Sterling's last bit of control. She didn't care that Honora was watching. She didn't care about anything but her own rage. I told you that you were being too slow. Sterling screamed. Before Vespera could move, Sterling swung her hand and struck Vespera across the face. The sound of the slap cracked through the speakers in the secret room like a gunshot. Vespera's head snapped to the side. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her stinging cheek. A small cut opened near her mouth, and a drop of red blood appeared, looking just like the color of Sterling's dress. Honora cried out in terror, pulling her floral cardigan tight around her shaking body. Kastor surged out of his chair, so fast it flipped over behind him. His vision went red. He let out a low, animal growl and slammed his fist into the desk, right next to the monitor. The glass groaned under the force. He wanted to tear the wall down. He wanted to fly through the screen and wrap his tattooed hands around Sterling's neck for touching the girl who had done nothing but show his mother kindness. He stared at the screen, watching Vespera stand tall even while she was hurting. She didn't cry. She didn't hit back. She just stood between Sterling and Honora like a shield. Kastor's heart, which he thought was made of ice, finally broke. He realized that the woman he was supposed to marry was a monster, and the maid he had always ignored was the bravest person he had ever known. Just a little longer, Kastor whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that promised a storm. Enjoy your power while you can, Sterling. Because when I walk out of this room, your world is going to end. Kastor was still breathing hard, his chest heaving as he stared at the screen where Vespera was holding his mother. The red mark on the maid's cheek looked like a brand, a permanent reminder of the monster he had almost invited into his family. He wanted to storm out of the library and end the charade right then, but a soft knock on the secret door stopped him. He didn't turn around when the door creaked open. He knew it was Marcus, his most trusted man and the only other person who knew about this room. Marcus walked in quietly, holding a thin black folder in his hands. Usually, Marcus was as calm as a stone wall, but today, his eyes looked sharp and worried. He stood beside Kastor, looking at the screens for a moment before turning his attention to his boss. The blue light from the monitors made the folder in his hands look even darker. "Boss," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "I have the information you asked for. I did a deep dive into the Reed family history. I checked everything, birth certificates, school records, and bank accounts." Kastor didn't take his eyes off the screen. Sterling was now pacing the living room, probably waiting for the man Kastor had seen her kissing earlier. "And? Tell me she isn't who she says she is. Give me a reason to finish this tonight." Marcus opened the folder and pulled out a grainy photograph. He held it up so Kastor could see. It was an old picture of a young woman with blonde hair, but she didn't look like the Sterling Reed currently sitting on Kastor's velvet sofa. "This is the real Sterling Reed," Marcus explained. "She was the daughter of a wealthy family in Chicago, but there was an accident 5 years ago in Europe. The real Sterling Reed never came home." Kastor finally turned his head, his eyes narrowed. He looked at the photo, then back at the woman on the monitor. If the real Sterling is gone, then who is in my living room wearing a 5-carat diamond ring? Marcus flipped to the next page. Her real name is Clara Thorne. She's a professional con artist. Her father was a small-time crook who taught her how to lie before she could even read. She specializes in finding wealthy families who live far away from society. She waits for a tragedy, steals an identity, and then finds a powerful man to marry. She doesn't want a husband, Kastor. She wants a bank account and a name that protects her from the law. Kastor felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It wasn't just a betrayal of the heart anymore. It was a professional attack on his empire. This woman had studied his life like a book. She had played the part of the perfect, high-class lady just to get close enough to pull the trigger. She had fooled his friends, his business partners, and worst of all, she had fooled him. She's been moving money too, Marcus continued, pointing to a list of bank transfers. Small amounts at first, so you wouldn't notice. But over the last 6 months, she shifted over $10 million into a private account in the Caribbean. She and that finance manager, Thomas, have been working together the whole time. They weren't just planning a wedding. They were planning your funeral. Kastor leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was the look a predator gives when it finally spots its prey in a trap. He thought about Vespera, who was currently cleaning up the mess Sterling had made. Vespera was a nobody with a pure heart, while Sterling was a somebody who turned out to be a ghost and a thief. She thinks she's the smartest person in the room, Kastor whispered, his voice like the edge of a razor. Hey family, before the story begins, I want you to do something real quick. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your comment fuel these stories. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button, because what happened next will leave you speechless. She thinks I'm just a big, dumb brute she can control. She wants to play a game? Fine. We'll play. He looked at Marcus, his eyes glowing with a dark fire. Keep watching the accounts. Let her move as much as she wants. I want her to think she's winning. I want her to feel completely safe. What about the wedding, boss? Marcus asked. Kastor stood up and straightened his black suit jacket. He looked at the screen one last time, watching Vespera whisper something to Honora that made the old woman smile. There isn't going to be a wedding. There's going to be a reckoning. And I'm going to make sure the whole world sees Clara Thorne for exactly what she is. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, orange shadows across the marble floors of the Moretti mansion. In the kitchen, Vespera moved quietly, her face still stinging from the blow she had taken earlier. She held a cold cloth to her cheek, trying to hide the swelling before the other staff members saw her. She didn't want to cause trouble, and she certainly didn't want Honora to worry more than she already did. Vespera was so focused on her work that she didn't hear the clicking of high heels until it was too late. Sterling stepped into the kitchen, her bright magenta dress glowing in the dim light. She looked like a queen, but the look in her eyes was like a hungry wolf. She didn't say a word at first. She just walked around Vespera, circling her like she was looking for a weak spot. You think you're so brave, don't you? Sterling finally whispered. Her voice was low and mean, like the hiss of a snake. You think Kastor will come home, and you can just tell him everything? You think he'll choose a little mouse like you over a woman like me? Vespera lowered the cloth from her face. She stood as tall as she could. I don't care about what you think of me. I only care about Honora. She is a human being, and you treat her like trash. Sterling let out a sharp, cold laugh. She stepped closer, invading Vespera's space until they were inches apart. Careful, Vespera. I've done my homework on you. I know why you work so hard. I know about your little brother, Daniel, in the hospital. I know he needs a very expensive surgery to stay alive. Vespera felt the air leave her lungs. Her heart began to race, and her hand started to shake. How do you know about Daniel? I know everything, Sterling sneered, a wicked grin spreading across her face. And I have a lot of friends in high places. If you say one word to Kastor, if you even look at him the wrong way, I will make sure your brother's name disappears from the surgery list. I will make sure no doctor in this city touches him. He will be on the street before the sun comes up tomorrow. Vespera felt a tear escape her eye and roll down her bruised cheek. This was the one thing that could break her. She could handle the slaps, the screaming, and the hard work, but she couldn't lose her brother. Daniel was all she had left. "Please," she choked out. "Leave him out of this. He's just a boy." "Then know your place," Sterling said, reaching out to pat Vespera's cheek right where it was bruised. "You are a shadow. You are a servant. Keep your mouth shut and keep polishing that silver, or your brother pays the price." In the secret room, Kastor watched the whole thing on the large center monitor. He was shaking with a rage so deep it felt like his heart was turning into a storm. He saw the pure terror on Vespera's face. He heard the way Sterling talked about a sick child as if he were nothing. He watched as Sterling walked out of the kitchen, looking proud of herself, leaving Vespera sobbing quietly into her hands. Kastor didn't slam his fist this time. Instead, he became deathly quiet. His hands were still, but his eyes were like cold fire. He reached out and touched the screen, his fingers resting right over the image of Vespera's crying face. He felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with business or money. He realized that this girl had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, and she had still found the strength to be kind to his mother. "She's wrong, Vespera," Kastor whispered into the darkness of the room. "You aren't a shadow. You're the only real light in this house. And I'm going to make sure that monster never touches you or your brother again." He picked up the phone and called Marcus. "Get the best hospital in the city on the line," he ordered. "Find a boy named Daniel Miller. I want him moved to a private room. I want the best doctors. And tell them the bill is being paid by Kastor Moretti. Do it now." Kastor sat back, watching Vespera wipe her eyes and pick up her cleaning cloth to go back to work. His heart was no longer made of ice. It was filled with a promise of protection. The hunt was almost over, and Sterling Reed, or whoever she really was, had no idea that she had just signed her own downfall. It was very late at night, and the grand Moretti mansion was finally quiet. In the secret room, Kastor sat in the dark, the blue light from the monitors reflecting in his tired eyes. He had spent the last few hours watching Sterling and Thomas celebrate their victory upstairs, drinking his expensive wine and laughing about their plans. But now, he switched the camera feed to the basement, where the staff lived. Kastor had lived in this house his whole life, but he realized he had never actually seen the rooms where the workers slept. Vespera's room was tiny, hardly bigger than a closet. There was a small bed, a wooden chair, and a single lamp that cast a weak, yellow glow. It was a cold, lonely place, and it made Kastor feel a strange pang of guilt in his chest. On the screen, Vespera was sitting on the edge of her bed. She wasn't wearing her gray uniform anymore, just a simple t-shirt. Without her ponytail, her brown hair fell over her shoulders, making her look even younger and more fragile. She was crying, but she wasn't making a sound. Her shoulders shook as she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to be brave even when she was all alone. Kastor watched as she reached into a small drawer and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She sat at the tiny desk, her hand trembling as she began to write. Kastor leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He used the remote to zoom the camera in until he could see the paper clearly. He could read every word as she wrote it. "Dear Honora," the letter started. "If I am not here tomorrow, please don't be sad. Sterling told me I have to leave, and she said she would hurt my brother if I didn't listen. I am so sorry I can't stay to protect you. You are the mother I never had, and caring for you was the only part of my life that felt like home. Please take your medicine and remember that I love you." Kastor felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He stared at the screen, his vision blurring for a second. He had spent 17 years as a mafia boss, dealing with the toughest criminals in the world, but he had never seen anything as brave as this. This girl had nothing, no money, no power, and a sick brother to worry about, yet her only thought was for his mother's safety. Sterling had called Vespera a shadow, but Kastor realized she was the only real thing in the whole mansion. She was the light that Sterling had tried so hard to blow out. He watched Vespera fold the letter with shaking fingers and hide it under her thin pillow. She turned off the lamp and lay down in the dark, still weeping silently. In the secret room, Kastor stood up and straightened his suit. His face was like stone, but his heart was on fire. He didn't need to see any more. He had seen the heart of a monster in Sterling, and he had seen the heart of an angel in Vespera. The test was over, and it was time for the boss to come out of the shadows. "Sleep well, Vespera," Kastor whispered to the dark monitor. "Tomorrow, you won't have to be afraid anymore. Tomorrow, the shadows are going to fight back." He picked up his phone and sent a one-word message to Marcus. Tomorrow. The next morning, the sun rose over the Moretti mansion, but the house felt like it was waiting for a storm to break. Upstairs, Sterling was sitting at the grand dining table, wearing a silky white robe and sipping expensive coffee. She looked relaxed and happy, like a queen who had finally taken over the castle. Thomas was standing near her, laughing as they talked about which of Kastor's cars they were going to sell first. They thought they had at least 3 more days before the boss returned. They thought they were safe. Suddenly, the loud, deep growl of an engine echoed through the long driveway. Sterling froze, her coffee cup stopping halfway to her mouth. She ran to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. Her face went pale, making her blonde hair look dull. A long, gleaming black Rolls-Royce was pulling up to the front steps. "It's Kastor," Sterling shrieked, her voice cracking with fear. "He's back." "Why is he back early?" Thomas jumped nearly a foot into the air. He scrambled to grab his briefcase, tripping over a chair in his hurry. "Hide. I have to hide," he hissed. He bolted toward the back door, disappearing into the gardens just seconds before the heavy front doors swung open. Sterling took a deep breath. She shook her head to make her hair look perfect and forced a sweet, angelic smile onto her face. By the time Kastor walked into the hall, she looked like the perfect, loving fiancée again. She ran toward him, her arms wide. "Kastor, my love. You're home," she cried, throwing her arms around his neck. "I missed you so much. Sicily must have been so lonely without me." Kastor stood there, letting her hug him. His body was stiff, like a pillar of cold marble. To Sterling, he just seemed tired from his trip. She didn't see the way his eyes turned into chips of ice as she touched him. She didn't know that just a few hours ago, he had been watching her hit his mother on a TV screen. "I missed you too, Sterling," Kastor said. His voice was deep and smooth, but there was a hidden edge to it, like a knife hidden in velvet. "I finished my business early. I couldn't wait to get back to my family." He stepped back and looked around the hall. Vespera was standing near the stairs, her head bowed. She was holding a cleaning cloth, and her gray uniform was neat, but Kastor immediately saw what he was looking for. Even though she had tried to cover it with makeup, he could see the slight swelling on her cheek and the faint red mark where Sterling had struck her. Kastor's heart hammered against his ribs. He wanted to walk over and tell Vespera she was safe, but he had to play the game for just a little longer. He looked back at Sterling, who was tucking a lock of hair behind her ear, looking perfectly innocent. "I have a great idea," Kastor said, his voice loud and cheerful. "Since I'm home early, we should celebrate. We will have a special family dinner tonight. Just you, me, my mother, and even Vespera." Sterling's smile faltered for a second. "Vespera? But she's just the maid, Kastor. Why would she eat with us?" Kastor reached out and patted Sterling's hand. His skin felt hot against hers. "She took such good care of my mother while I was gone. It's the least I can do to thank her. Don't you agree?" Sterling swallowed hard, feeling a strange knot of worry in her stomach. But she didn't want to make Kastor suspicious. "Of course, darling. Whatever you want." Kastor turned away so she couldn't see the dark promise in his eyes. The trap was set. Sterling thought she was getting a fancy dinner, but Kastor knew the truth. Tonight, the screens would turn off, the masks would be ripped away, and the nobody, Maid, would finally get the justice she deserved. The grand dining room was filled with the soft glow of dozens of white candles. The silver on the long table was polished, so brightly it looked like mirrors, and the scent of expensive red roses filled the air. To anyone walking in, it looked like a perfect, happy family getting ready for a feast. But for those sitting at the table, the air felt thick and heavy, like the moments right before a lightning strike hits the ground. Kastor sat at the head of the table, his back straight and his dark hair perfectly slicked. He wore his black suit jacket, and his tattooed hands rested calmly on the white tablecloth. To his right, Sterling sat in her bright magenta dress. She had spent an hour on her makeup to hide the fact that she was nervous, but her fingers kept twitching as she adjusted her silk napkin. Across from her sat Thomas, the finance manager. Kastor had insisted he join them to celebrate the business success in Italy. Thomas was sweating so much his collar was damp, and he couldn't even look Kastor in the eye. At the other end of the table sat Honora in her wheelchair. She looked fragile in her floral cardigan, but when she looked at Kastor, her eyes were clear and steady. Beside her was the empty chair Kastor had saved for Vespera. The door opened, and Vespera walked in. She looked terrified. She was still in her gray maid's uniform, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She stopped at the edge of the room, her eyes darting toward Sterling, who was glaring at her with pure hatred. "Sit down, Vespera," Kastor said. His voice wasn't loud, but it filled the room like thunder. "Kastor, really," Sterling said, letting out a fake, high-pitched laugh. "The girl has work to do. She can eat in the kitchen later. It's embarrassing to have the help at the table." Kastor turned his head slowly to look at Sterling. The candlelight made his eyes look like golden fire. "In this house, I decide who is help and who is family. Vespera, sit." Vespera sat down on the edge of the chair, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She looked at the plate in front of her, but she couldn't imagine eating a single bite. She could feel Sterling's eyes burning into her, a silent promise that if she said a word, Daniel would pay the price. The meal began in a silence so deep it was painful. The only sound was the clink of silver forks against china. Kastor took a slow sip of his wine, watching the three people in front of him. He looked like a hunter watching three rabbits cornered in a fence. "So, Sterling," Kastor said casually, "how was my mother while I was away? Did she give you any trouble?" Sterling put on her sweetest smile, though her eyes remained cold. "Oh, she was just fine, darling. We spent so much time together. I made sure she had everything she needed. Didn't I, Vespera?" Vespera felt a lump in her throat. She looked at Honora, then at the floor. She thought of the letter under her pillow and the threat against her brother. "Yes," she whispered, her voice shaking. Kastor didn't blink. He turned to Thomas. "And the accounts, Thomas? Is my money safe and sound?" Thomas nearly choked on a piece of bread. "Yes, boss. Everything is perfect, just like we talked about." Kastor leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was the scariest smile Vespera had ever seen. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of a man who had already won. "I'm glad to hear that," Kastor said, "because I have a special surprise for our dessert tonight. I brought home a very special video for my trip. Well, actually, I didn't have to go to Sicily to get it. I filmed it right here in this house." Sterling's face went from pale to gray. She dropped her fork, and it landed on her plate with a loud clack. "A video? What are you talking about, Kastor?" Kastor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He looked around the table one last time. He saw the guilt on Sterling's face, the terror on Thomas's, and the quiet hope in Vespera's eyes. "I think it's time we stop pretending," Kastor said, his voice turning into ice. "Let's see what happens in this house when the boss isn't looking." He pressed the button, and the large TV on the wall hummed to life. The large television on the wall flickered to life, and the dining room went as quiet as a grave. Sterling stared at the screen, her fork frozen in her hand. The first video showed the front door of the mansion. There was Sterling, looking beautiful in her magenta dress, waving and blowing kisses to Kastor's car as it drove away. She looked like the perfect, loving fiancée. But then, the video showed the door closing. On the screen, Sterling's face changed instantly. She looked disgusted. She wiped her mouth as if Kastor's kiss had been poison. She pulled out her phone and snapped. "He's finally gone. Get over here now." Thomas let out a small, choke sound. He tried to push his chair back, but Marcus appeared from the shadows and placed a heavy, tattooed hand on Thomas's shoulder, forcing him to stay seated. The video skipped forward. Now it showed the grand hall. Sterling was wrapped in Thomas's arms, kissing him right in the spot where Kastor had proposed to her. They were laughing about how stupid Kastor was and how easy it would be to steal his money. Sterling's face on the screen was full of greed. At the table, the real Sterling began to shake so hard that her wine glass rattled against the table. Kastor, wait. I can explain. Sterling cried out, her voice high and desperate. Kastor didn't even look at her. He kept his eyes on the screen. Watch, Sterling. The best part is coming up. The next clip showed Honora's bedroom. The room gasped as they watched Sterling scream at the sick woman, calling her a burden and an obstacle. They saw Sterling knock the medicine tray onto the floor, scattering the pills everywhere like tiny white stones. Then came the moment that made Kastor's eyes turn into black fire. The screen showed Sterling swinging her hand and slapping Vespera across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the dining room. On the screen, Vespera didn't run. She stood there, bleeding and bruised, just to keep Sterling away from Honora. Kastor stood up slowly. He looked like a giant in the candlelight. He walked around the table until he was standing right behind Vespera. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his tattoos dark against her gray uniform. It was the first time he had ever publicly shown that he cared for her. You called her a shadow, Sterling, Kastor said, his voice low and dangerous. You called her a nobody. But while you were busy being a monster, this nobody was the only one acting like a Moretti. She protected my mother while you were plotting to kill me. Sterling fell out of her chair and onto her knees. She crawled toward Kastor, her blonde hair falling in her face. Kastor, please. I love you. Thomas made me do it. Kastor looked down at her with pure disgust. You don't love me. You don't even know me. And I know you aren't Sterling Reed. The room went completely silent. Sterling froze, her eyes widening in terror. The real Sterling Reed died years ago, Kastor continued. Your name is Clara Thorne. You're a thief and a liar. You thought you could come into my house, hurt my mother, and threaten a girl who has more heart in her pinky finger than you have in your whole body. Kastor looked at Marcus and gave a small nod. Marcus and two other large men stepped forward. They grabbed Thomas and Sterling by the arms. Thomas was crying like a baby, and Sterling was screaming, her face contorted in rage just like it was on the monitor. They were dragged out of the room, their voices fading as the heavy doors closed behind them. The room was quiet again. Kastor looked down at Vespera. She was looking up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. He reached out and gently touched the bruise on her cheek. You don't ever have to be afraid again, Vespera, Kastor whispered. Your brother is safe. You are safe. From now on, you aren't the maid. You're the reason this family is still standing. Honora reached out and took Vespera's hand, a small, tired smile on her face. The storm had finally broken, and for the first time in 17 years, the Moretti mansion felt like a home. A month had passed since the night of the big dinner, and the Moretti mansion felt like a completely different world. The heavy, dark curtains in the library were pulled wide open, letting the warm summer sun dance across the floor. The secret room was now locked and empty, because Kastor Moretti didn't need to hide anymore. He had finally found the truth he was looking for. In the backyard, the green grass was soft and bright. Honora sat in her wheelchair under the shade of a large oak tree, wearing a new blue sweater. She wasn't trembling as much anymore, and she had a real, happy smile on her face. She was watching a young boy run across the lawn with a soccer ball. That boy was Daniel, Vespera's little brother. Thanks to Kastor's help, he had received his surgery and was getting stronger every single day. Vespera stood by the garden gate, watching her brother play. She wasn't wearing the gray maid's uniform or the white apron anymore. Instead, she wore a simple, pretty floral dress. The bruise on her cheek was completely gone, and her eyes, which used to be full of sadness, were now bright with hope. She didn't feel like a shadow anymore. She felt like she finally belonged. Kastor walked out onto the porch, straightening the sleeves of his black shirt. He didn't look like a scary mafia boss today. When he saw Vespera, his hard face softened. He walked over to her and stood by her side, watching Daniel score a goal against a make-believe goalie. "He's fast," Kastor said, a real smile touching his lips. "The doctors said he'll be back to full strength by the end of the summer." Vespera turned to him, her eyes shining. "I still can't believe it's real, Kastor. A month ago, I was writing a goodbye letter to Honora, thinking I would lose everything. Now my brother is healthy, and I don't have to be afraid." Kastor reached out and took her hand. His tattooed fingers were gentle as he squeezed hers. "You were never just a maid, Vespera. You were the only person brave enough to do the right thing when everyone else was lying. You saved my mother, and you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." He looked over at Honora, who was cheering for Daniel. "My mother was right," Kastor whispered. "She told me to watch for a person's real face. I spent so long looking at money and fancy clothes that I almost missed the most beautiful heart I've ever known." Vespera leaned her head against Kastor's shoulder. She realized that she didn't just find a job or a place to stay. She had found a family. And Kastor had found something even better than power or money. He had found someone he could finally trust with his whole heart. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, the three of them, Kastor, Vespera, and Honora, sat together on the porch. The cold, dark shadows of the past were gone. For the first time in 17 years, the house was filled with the sound of laughter. They had all been broken in different ways, but together they were finally whole. The mafia boss had started a secret mission to find a liar, but he ended up finding something much better, a home built on real love. Did Sterling get exactly what she deserved, or was Kastor too easy on her? Let me know in the comments. If you loved seeing the truth come to light, smash that like button to stand with Vespera. Don't forget to subscribe and join our family so you never miss a moment of justice. Check out our playlist for more tales of betrayal and redemption. Like, subscribe, and comment Mafia below if you watched until the very end. See you in the next video.